Hi, boys and girls. I'm so glad you're joining me again for another lesson in God's Word. This is a wonderful lesson showing us the power of God over the most powerful country, the most powerful king in the entire world during that time. And that was the country of Egypt. And we find this lesson in chapters 11 and 12 in the book of Exodus. So, they've already suffered the 9 plagues, and God has devastated the entire country of Egypt. No crops, no livestock. Everything has just been destroyed. And here Moses approaches Pharaoh again for the last time, and he says, if you don't let the Israelites leave Egypt, God is going to bring the worst of the plagues upon you in this last one. Well, this infuriates Pharaoh. He hates the sight of Moses and Aaron, and he hates this God that has destroyed his country, and he will refuse to bow down before him. In the 10th chapter, it says, Pharaoh said to Moses, "Get away from me. Take heed to yourself, and see my face no more. For in the day you see my face, you will die." And Moses said, "You have spoken well. I will never see your face again." And God tells Moses, "Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month," and this would be equivalent to our month of March, "on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household's too small for the lamb," or in other words, if the household is too small to eat an entire lamb at this feast, then go to your neighbor and take it according to the number of persons, as every man has need. None of it is to be wasted, this sacrificial lamb. All of it is to be eaten, and what little is left, cling to the bones, it is to be burned. Your lamb shall be without blemish. It can't have had a broken leg or anything, no sores, no diseases. It has to be 100% pure and healthy. Has to be a male of the first year, and you can take it from the sheep or from the goats. And he also tells Moses, this month, it would be equivalent to our month of March, shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. And boys and girls, what month starts our new year? Well, we know that is January, but God is changing their new year to begin in the month of March. Now, previous to this, the Hebrews had been celebrating the first month of their new year in September, but no longer will they do that. Now, the beginning of their new year will be March, just like ours is in January. And they still observe that, the Jews, even today. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood that's in the basin. And none of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning. So, when they applied the blood covering on their house, on the doorpost and the lintel of the house, they could not leave that blood-covered house. The Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to strike you. So it wasn't enough just to kill that sacrificial lamb and to partake of that feast, they had to personally apply the blood of that sacrificial lamb over their house, or to have their house covered in a symbolic way with the blood of that sacrifice. It was the only place of safety, was inside the houses that were sanctified by the blood. Now, do you remember what the word sanctified means? We've studied that before. It means set apart. So every house that had applied the blood of the sacrificial lamb to it, it was set apart from every other house in the whole country of Egypt. And you had to be inside that house that was set apart, or you would die if you were the firstborn son. And you shall eat it with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. So shall you eat it in haste. In other words, you're not going to be sitting down and eating this meal. You're not going to be just wearing anything. You put on your sandals, you have your staff, be fully dressed, and you eat that meal in haste, because you don't know what hour that Pharaoh is going to let you go this night. Be ready at all times. And it says, it is the Lord's Passover. You shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. In other words, this is not a common meal. This is not your regular supper. This is a special Passover feast that you will be observing. For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment, gods that were nothing. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. So, if you want to escape the destroyer, you better make sure you're inside one of those houses that have been set apart with the blood. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So, let's talk just a minute about this special Passover feast. It's going to become a table of remembrance all the way up until the death of Christ. The last Passover feast, Jesus shares with his disciples. And it says in verse 24, and you shall observe this thing, what thing? This Passover feast as an ordinance for you and your sons forever. So what does the word observe mean? You shall observe this thing. It means you're to understand exactly what you're doing. Study it. Don't eat it in ignorance like it's a common meal. And the word ordinance means it's a set appointment. You don't eat that Passover meal just any time of the day or year. No, you eat it at a set appointed time. It will come to pass when you come to the land which the Lord will give you, just as he promised, you shall keep this service. So what does it mean to keep this service? You are to observe it. You are to preserve it. Make sure that it is observed every single year and that it is never forgotten to observe that Passover feast. And it shall be when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? What is this Passover feast that we're partaking of? he says you're to teach the children. Don't let them grow up in ignorance about what this feast is all about. You teach them exactly what they're doing, why you're doing it, and tell them all about the history of God bringing you out of Egypt when you were slaves. And when they ask you, you shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice of the Lord, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our household. So, when you teach them, you're proclaiming it, not only to your family, but to your neighbors. Everyone that sees you observe this every single year will wonder, what are you doing? And it's a perfect time to teach them why you're doing it and who God is and his magnificent power. When you remember it, it'll be a table of remembrance. Do not take it without remembering God's power and why you're taking it. And it came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. Or in other words, from the greatest to the lowest, even prisoners in the dungeon, the firstborn was struck by death. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. Every single house that did not have the blood on it, there was someone dead inside of it. Then he called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, Rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel. Go and serve the Lord as you have said. They could not wait for him to be gone. Well, because of Joseph, Egypt was a very rich country. You remember all the riches that he accumulated for the Pharaoh 400 years earlier made them the most wealthy country in the entire world. They even buried their pharaohs in gold caskets. There's one on display in a museum in Cairo, Egypt. Oh, I'd love to go see that. Oh, I'd love to see it. And you can see different artifacts that are from that period. Well, in chapter 11, verses 2 and 3, God says, Speak now in the hearing of the people, and let every man ask from his neighbor, his Egyptian neighbor, and every woman from her neighbor, her Egyptian neighbor, articles of silver and articles of gold. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of the people. There was not one person in the entire country of Egypt who did not know the name of Moses and who did not know the name of God. I'd like to read from Psalms 105, verses 37 through 40. The writer writes a chapter about this. It says in verse 37, He also brought them out with silver and gold, and there was none feeble among his tribes. God had thoroughly prepared them for this long journey. There was not one feeble person in all of the tribes of Israel. They were all able-bodied to make the journey. Egypt was glad when they departed, for the fear of them had fallen upon them. In verse 38 and 39, He spread a cloud for a covering and a fire to give light in the night, And the people asked, and he brought quail and satisfied them with the bread of heaven. Back to Exodus, the 12th chapter, in verse 36. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so they granted them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. God showed them, how dare you forget where you got all your wealth? You got it because I worked through Joseph to give it to you. And you are not honoring me, giving me credit for having supplied all that wealth in Egypt. Then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, and about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. A mixed multitude went up with them also, flocks and herds and a great deal of livestock. So they're just numbering about 600,000 men on foot. So you just think, the men, that's not counting the men's wives, or their mothers, or their children. So it's estimated about 1.5 million people, or Israelites, left Egypt. And in verse 38, it says a mixed multitude went up with them also. Who do you think the mixed multitude was? Any Egyptian or any foreigner who wanted to join themselves to God's people, they were welcome to join them. Even because can you imagine how many Egyptians were converted and believed in God and denounced all their foreign gods that were worthless, powerless? You see, anybody that wants to become one of God's people is welcome. I don't care what nationality you are. It does not matter how bad you've been in the past. God welcomes everyone to be his people. And now, we're going to find later on in the book of Numbers and chapter 11 that a lot of these Egyptians became a bad influence, because it says, we remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. Well, the Israelites were slaves. They didn't enjoy all that fabulous food. In other scriptures, it says they remembered the pomegranates and all the good things they had to eat in Egypt. Well, now they're complaining, but now our whole being is dried up. There is nothing at all except this manna before our eyes. So, look at verse 4. Now the mixed multitude who were among them, they have started the grumbling and the murmuring and the complaining. They yielded to intense cravings of their appetite. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, who will give us this meat to eat? Wow, what a bad influence they were. You see, the Israelites, they were used to not eating rich foods. They were content with what little they had to eat as slaves. But now, these Egyptians who are among them, who have been used to eating the fat of the land and the best of anything there was to eat, wow, it has greatly affected them. Now, as I close this lesson, remember in the first chapter, or the second chapter, when Moses asked God, what is your name? Who shall I say sent me to Egypt? And God said, chapter 3, and God said to Moses, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. So boys and girls, do you think the Egyptians know God's name now. Thank you for joining me again, and I hope you learned something special. And we're going to talk next week about how the Passover is, how it is a type of the Lord's Supper that we partake of every week on the first day. I hope you'll join me again for that lesson. Bye-bye, boys and girls. Teachers, I want you to know that the clip art and gifts come from Google Images, and the free clip art that I'm using comes from Sweet Publishing Company, and you can go to their website to download them. And I thank them so much for making these available to all of us for free. Thank you for joining me, and bye-bye. I'll see you next week.